Big group. Who's Ethan? This quarter, I really want this class to be super informal as far as structure and what we're doing. I really want to hear primarily from who's in the class on the reading. So I have kind of some thoughts on some class expectations. Basically, since we don't have a lesson book, kind of like we did in auditorium, the expectation is we just do our reading and come prepared to discuss. And ultimately, what I ask is that you provide feedback to me on how the class is going. If the discussion needs to go a different direction, maybe there's some different things we should try and do differently, we will. That being said, the structure I do have in my mind is basically we're gonna start with our reading for the week and just work through it. Hear from you guys on what you took away from the reading. I've notes on what I took away from the reading, so I'm happy to share those things, but I think the class will be more enjoyable for everybody if we all just share what we went through. If that conversation starts to die down, I have some, I call them guided discussion plans, some text topics, things like that we can work through as well. So that's kind of the direction we're going with the class. These QR codes, I set up a group me. If you scan those QR codes, you can join that group me. And I want to use that as a way of communicating with the people who are in the class. There's going to be some things at the end. I'm going to try to kind of give a challenge for the week from the text, something that we've read about that maybe we can apply throughout the week. I want to give some reminders on that, but I also want to use that as more of a discussion thread. If there's things that we don't talk about in class that come up that you'd like to, that can be a good catalyst for those types of conversations. So you can scan the QR code and join that group me if you would like to be a part of that. Matthew, would you lead us in a prayer here?
That's great. Dear Lord, thank you for today. Thank you for letting us come together. We thank you especially for providing local congregations where we can assemble, discuss your word together, pray, sing, remember your Son through the Lord's Supper, and ultimately be encouraged and stir one another up towards love and good works. We thank you especially for your word and your Son, and it's in his name we pray. Amen.
Really have the last 2 weeks worth of reading on notes for that, since we didn't have our class this last Sunday. So if we go all the way back to Deuteronomy 29, all the way through the book of Joshua, that's what we've covered over the last 2 weeks. What things stood out to you as significant in that reading?
Joshua was appointed leader after Moses died to bring the people into Canaan and ultimately divide the land as an inheritance among various tribes.
Joshua being appointed as the leader. I did in Joshua 1, Moses appoints Joshua, be strong and of good courage. He talks several times through the end of Deuteronomy with that terminology, Deuteronomy 31, verse 6 and verse 7 and verse 23. Moses is delivering those words to the people, to Joshua, be strong and very courageous. And then in Joshua 1, it switches, and now the Lord's talking to Joshua, telling Joshua, be strong and of good courage. You're the leader. I'm with you. Go lead the people on this mission of taking the land. And in Joshua 1, in verse 16, Joshua 1 and verse 16, you see the people accept Joshua as their leader. So they answered Joshua, saying, all that you command us, we will do, and wherever you send us, we will go. Just as we heeded Moses in all things, so we will heed you. Only the Lord your God be with you, as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your command and does not heed your words, and all that you command him shall be put to death. Only be strong and of good courage. I find a couple things interesting. Number one, the people saw Joshua as the leader. They saw him as the God-appointed leader. We followed Moses as the God-appointed leader. We're going to follow you as the God-appointed leader. Then all the messaging of Moses, be strong and of good courage. And now the message of God to Joshua, be strong and of good courage. The people are now telling Joshua, now you be strong and of good courage. You lead us the way God has instructed us. I think that is really interesting as you get into that. What else?
One thing that you just said that struck a chord with me is that, Joshua said, all that you command, they answered Joshua and said, all that you command us, we will do, just as we heeded Moses in all things. Often we, or at least I think about Israel in terms of disobedience, but they really pledged allegiance to God and to his will. And it's interesting to me in chapter 23 that Joshua says in verse 8, that you shall hold fast to the Lord your God as you have done to this day. So this generation was a generation, it seems, that was faithful to God. They've wandered through the wilderness all these years as really as children and young people, now adults, and they had entered in and conquered the land according to God's instruction. So Israel not only is an example of disobedience for us, but in many ways an example of what faithfulness should look like.
Yeah, and Joshua's a good example of looking at their faithfulness. We're going to move into Judges and see their cycle of disobedience time and time again. So it is interesting because Joshua 24 wraps up saying that, this generation was faithful so long as Joshua was alive. And then we transition in the beginning of Judges and we see their pledge of allegiance, their choice of faithfulness begins to deteriorate.
And I think that does show the importance of good leadership. I mean, Joshua was a good leader for the people. I mean, Moses had flaws as a leader. He was a good leader too. So that's not a perfect, you can still have good leadership and people still go astray. But I think you're right. I think it's so clear that when Joshua was gone from Israel, then that generation rose. And they follow that cycle that you see in Judges.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say that in that passage that Cal just read in Joshua 1:17, just as we heeded Moses in all things, it's interesting that our memory is selective. So they didn't, truthfully, they didn't heed Moses in all things, but now they seem to recall that.
Sometimes we have a little inflated self-image.
Well, and to that point also, I think about how that generation that had been so disobedient died in the wilderness. And it's a reflection on how it can work both ways, that one generation can be really unfaithful to God and the next generation be very faithful to God. And then maybe the next generation after them is unfaithful again. It's kind of the pattern we see here. And so it's both a opportunity for us to sort of hope in the sense of about the faithfulness of our children, maybe exceeding our own faithfulness or the faithfulness of our generation, but also a warning that we have to be very thoughtful about that transmission of faith to our children and grandchildren.
To that point, if you think about the end of the book of Joshua, Joshua 24, and the Israelites kind of reaffirm their covenant relationship with the Lord in Joshua 24. Joshua walks them through their history of God's faithfulness. It goes back to Abraham, and from Abraham all the way through the conquest of Canaan. Here's how God has been faithful to you. And then he encourages them, now choose for yourself who you're going to serve. And he brings that to that individual responsibility. Like, I've chosen to follow the Lord. My house has chosen to follow the Lord. I can't make you do that, but here's all the evidence of why this is a good choice. You should make that choice. And they said, well, we're going to follow the Lord. And you see they kind of have a back and forth. It's almost like Joshua's like, well, are you really sure you're gonna follow the Lord? Here's all the consequences of choosing to now, but turning from them later. He goes through all that in Joshua 24. It is interesting. It's very much about kind of their personal accountability to that choice. What else?
That end of that chapter that you just mentioned, reminds me of Jesus' question to Peter, do you love me? And so we can all see ourselves in that response to that, see ourselves in the response from the Israelites. Their intent was to obey, but that wasn't always what happened. You see right there in chapter 23 of Joshua. Joshua says, surely the Lord, your God, has given you the good things he promised. So we know God keeps his promises. And even knowing that, we still fall short. In verse 16, he says, if you break the covenant of your Lord your God by worshiping and serving other gods, his anger will burn against you. So they had witnessed that, not just through the 40 years, but even, well, most of these people weren't alive at that time, but their ancestors. Even though we have all the history, we still fall short from time to time. So we have to not only remember God's promises for those positive things, but the negative as well. There's a not but, and there's a big if.
With God keeping to his word, if we go back to the beginning of our reading 2 weeks ago at the end of Deuteronomy, how did God keep his word in a way that doesn't seem all that positive to everybody, especially Moses? Right? Moses, the faithful leader, still had to pay the consequence for his sin because God keeps his promises. Told Moses, you aren't going to enter the land. And regardless of all that Moses did to kind of re-earn favor in the sight of the Lord, he still had to bear that consequence. I think that's a really good point to see all the way from the transition of power at the very beginning to the very end. That's a good point.
But I mean, you see that then in Exodus, you see it in Joshua. God's covenant was just that. It was a covenant. It was something that there were things to be done by both parties. And so in Deuteronomy, you see very clearly laid out, not just, and this is what we want to focus on today. We want to hear all the blessings that come from following God, right? And they did that, and they enumerated those blessings. But then they also said, here's the curses if you don't follow God. And I think sometimes that's the part we want to leave out. And so, Joshua, when he lays forth that famous choose this day, he was really telling them to choose between the blessings and the cursings.
Yeah.
And God's message has always been very clear about the two sides of that, and in that it's a choice.
Yeah. With that, let's look at Deuteronomy 30. In Deuteronomy 30, we see Moses is kind of delivering his final exhortation to the people to choose faithfulness. Let's read verses 11 through 14 together. For this commandment which I command you today is not too mysterious for you, nor is it far off. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend into heaven for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it? Nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it? But the word is very near you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it. He's talked about the blessings and the cursings, and very similar to the conversation we're having, he's kind of telling them, make the choice. I'm encouraging you to choose to follow God. I think verses 11 through 14 here are really significant, because Paul is going to take these words in Romans 10 and apply them to our salvation. But what's the message? Obedience. I think it's kind of getting to the simplicity of
It's
it.
clear, yeah, he says, you don't need somebody to come down from heaven and explain this to you, it's evident.
Maybe we overcomplicate our faith sometimes. We make, mountains out of hills, and we just kind of overcomplicate some things, and Moses is kind of addressing that with the people here. And it's not so complicated that you can't do it. It's very doable. It's not hard to understand. It's clear. It's easy. It's there. It reminds me of the words he spoke to them before in chapter 11, that the law was to be on their hearts, and they were to implant the word on their hearts and the hearts of their children. It's very near. It's not far off.
Also like how it's something that this is also doable for you guys, like y'all can. This isn't too difficult for you to understand, it's also not too hard for you to do. I mean, the end of verse 14 in my translation is like, so that you can do it. Also reminds me of 1 Corinthians 10, talking about how it won't be tempted beyond what we can manage. It's like, I don't think anybody's thinking here, hey, it's just gonna be a walk in the park the whole time, but it's fairly simple, and you can do it. It's possible for you, it's possible for anybody to follow these. And you just kind of have to, you might have to work on yourself a little bit, but you can do it.
Along those same lines, later on that same chapter, on 30, we talked about this last week. The choices are really simple. It's life or death, blessing or cursing. And then he says, therefore, choose life, that both you and your descendants may live. It's interesting that Joshua uses the same words. He says, choose you this day who will serve. And so, we're free moral agents. We can make choices for ourselves. But the choices are very simple, and they're, life and blessing are attainable, as just mentioned. We just have to do it and to choose it.
Well, that's a good point. I think part of the point is a failure to choose life and blessings is choosing the curses. There's not like the passive middle ground here. You either choose life or you've chosen death. You've chosen the opposite. Jump ahead on into the book of Joshua, spend some time through the text here. In Joshua 1, as we've talked about already, Joshua is appointed the leader in the end of Deuteronomy. Moses goes on the mountain to die. The Lord is faithful to his word there. Now Joshua comes. He is now the leader. Be strong and very courageous. He's told over and over again. The Lord promises his presence with him. I think it's significant, just as far as history is concerned, to see the Lord communicated directly to Moses, and now the Lord's communicating directly to Joshua. So it's very significant. We jump forward just a little bit to the story. See if I can, what chapter it was in here. When the commander of the Lord's army comes, they're right around Jericho. I have it here on one of these pages. When the commander of the Lord's army comes, it's like an embodiment almost of the Lord keeping his promise to be with Joshua. See if I can find that for us. Chapter 5. Thank you, Matthew.
13.
Yeah. And it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, are you for us or for our adversaries? So he said, no, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshiped, and said to him, what does my Lord say to his servant? Then the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy." And Joshua did so. It's like, to me, that's such a powerful interaction that I would love to see the rest of. Like, what did the commander of the Lord's army tell Joshua other than take your sandals off, the place where you stand is holy? What's interesting about that, though?
So exactly what happened to Moses when God first called Moses.
We go back to the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 3, Moses at the burning bush, he's confronted in the presence of God, take off your sandals, the place where you stand is holy. It's God calling Moses to be the leader. It's the same story here with Joshua, take your sandal off, the place where you stand is holy ground. What else? It's another story we read about, where we see a very similar character. This would have been a few weeks ago that we've read through it. Balaam and Balak. The character, very similar image in Numbers 22, verse 23. Let's turn over there. Balaam is choosing to not follow God's instruction here. And I know we spent time in this story in the class last quarter, but we see in verse 22 of Numbers 22, then God's anger was aroused because he went, and the angel of the Lord took his stand in the way as an adversary against him. And he was riding on his donkey, and his two servants were with him. Now the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand. And the donkey turned aside out of the way and went into the field. So Balaam struck the donkey to turn her back onto the road. We think about that with the man standing opposite of Joshua with a sword drawn in his hand. Joshua are for us or against us. What's interesting in Numbers is it wasn't this angel that comes and confronts Balaam here, causes the donkey to veer off course. The angel was not adversarial to Balaam, it was Balaam being adversarial towards the Lord. Kind of interesting. Joshua, are you for us or against us? Talking to the commander of the army of the Lord, he's like, you're asking the wrong question. Are you for me? Like, take your sandals off. You're standing on holy ground. Like, show your allegiance to me. I just think that image is a really interesting one to think about, really powerful. Anything else in that Joshua 5? Yeah.
Well, you were causing me to think about, this imagery of the command of the Lord's army, the sword drawn. I was thinking about Jesus as he presented himself to John in Revelation 1 as one who had the sharp two-edged sword out of his mouth. His countenance was like the sun shining in its strength. And then he tells John, don't be afraid, I am the first and the last. I'm he who lives and is dead. Behold, I'm alive forevermore. And it's right after that that he tells John to write these 7 letters to these churches. You think about how, just like in the days of Israel, at least in the generation that Moses lived in, and for the most part, Israel was given over to rebellion and disobedience to God. And yet there were a few who were worthy, like Joshua, Caleb, who received the promise. And so just after Jesus speaks of himself as this one who has a sharp two-edged sword out of his mouth, he instructs John to write these letters to the churches. And one of the things he instructs John to write is in chapter 3 of Revelation. In verse 4, he said, you have a few names even in Sardis who have not defiled their garments. They shall walk with me in white, for they are worthy. God knows each of us individually, but he also recognizes the general temperament of his people, whether or not they're obedient or not. So I've got the choice, regardless of what the people around me choose, I've got the choice to be courageous and to follow after the one who has a sharp two-edged sword and trust in him, or to follow after him.
So with that, I'm just curious. I don't have a good answer. Who's the commander of the Lord's army here?
Kind of inspired marginal note here. It says, it was, angel of the Lord. Thank the Lord. One of the things that I found really interesting in that same chapter is, the second generation having to be circumcised.
Yeah,
Those were the folks who grew up in the wilderness. And it's, I don't really have an answer, it's just interesting, when Dorothy and I read this last week, we'd forgotten about that. And it was just odd that the practice was neglected for those 4 years. And then here they are now grown men having to be circumcised. So it just seems strange. If the Lord would allow that or overlook that, the fact that they were really not acceptable to God in that condition.
That was a sign of the covenant.
Yeah.
It just shows he lets us make our choices.
that section there, that circumcision caught my attention too, kind of the same thing I told Ali, I said, I don't know what the so what is here, but it's a good point, Richard. I said something to Ali about that this morning. I said, I looked at it and it's almost like God allowed them to choose not to. Because you see through Deuteronomy, what's happening in Deuteronomy, they're re-giving the law. You would think at some point it'd be like, all right, fix it. But it's not until they're like going into the land to take the promised land. And the verse that caught my attention is verse 9, when he says, "This day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." Like we're taking all of that, we're putting it behind us. It's the thing of the past now. Maybe this is a little, not the right way to say it, but it's almost like God allowed that to happen almost for the symbolic purpose of the circumcision happening here as they're going into the land. Anybody else have thoughts on that?
It seems like Moses being the leader and each tribe had a leader that they would have attempted, and they may have, we just don't know, who have enforced that.
Yeah.
There are people today that don't believe baptism is necessary.
Sure.
And they believe they're perfectly fine. But that's not what we read in God's order. And God allows each of us to make our own choice.
Sure.
And we'll have to answer for that someday.
Yeah.
I mean, we previously seen circumcision didn't seem to be a priority for Moses back in Exodus chapter 4, where he got in trouble with God for that. And that doesn't seem to have changed. It doesn't seem to have been something he really learned to emphasize.
After that encounter in Exodus 4, it just popped in my head now as well. You think about Exodus 4, you would think, and just logically speaking, you would think like that would have been the wake up call to Moses to be like, this is like high priority stuff that we got to get worked out. Leads me to the question, when did they stop circumcising? Is it in Egypt? Was it the generation before? Was it their parent? Like, who stopped doing the circumcising and when? That's, it's just interesting to think about. I think the kind of follow up to that is it's like the circumcision was necessary. They did it, verse 9, they put off the reproach of Egypt, and then they go on and what do they memorialize in those next few verses? It's the circumcision and then the Passover, right? They keep the Passover. So they're about to go into the land and God's having them go back through and circumcise themselves. Show yourself as set apart. You're my special people. We're putting off the reproach of Egypt. By the way, let's remember now what I did for you in Egypt. And what I did for you in Egypt to deliver you from the hands of your adversaries. Now we're going into the promised land and I'm going to deliver the adversaries in your hands. Just real interesting how that timing lines up, right? They're going to go in and the Passover just happens to be right on the front edge of that.
Those are all really monumental, events, you know, the reinstitution of the Passover and the circumcision. But the other thing that's minor, but what I thought was interesting in verse 12, is that the manna ceased. On that day. And so now they're expected to eat of the bounty of the land of Canaan. That flows with milk and honey. So,
I think that's another symbolic way of God, saying, hey, I'm faithful, I've kept my promise, I've sustained you through the wilderness. The land's now yours for the taking. That's a very powerful verse there in verse 12, I think. I want to step back just real quick and then we'll keep moving forward, but you think about the crossing of the Jordan River. When God calls Joshua, tells him, hey, this is what we're gonna go do. We're gonna go in, and God effectively tells Joshua on the front edge, says like, I'm gonna make this a big display, like I'm gonna use this to show the people that you're the leader. And so he goes, they cross the Jordan River, it's really, impressive scene. They carrying the ark into the water's separating, them crossing on dry land. I think Joshua's response to that is significant in chapter 4. In chapter 4, verse 24, he's talking about what's just happened, and he wraps it up. And this has happened that all the peoples of the earth may know the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. It's interesting because before that, in chapter 3, verse 7, it says, and the Lord said to Joshua, this day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that I was with you, or that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. So the Lord says, I'm going to show them that I'm with you, and we're going to cross through this land, and you're going to see this great display of power. And that's my sign to the people that I'm with you, as I was with Moses. Moses had the power. Stick his staff out over the Red Sea, the waters parted. It's great display. Joshua, you're going to lead people across the Jordan on dry land, just as we did with Moses. They get across, and Joshua doesn't say, God's with me. Look at this. God's with me. Like, he doesn't make it about him. It's the point. It's a good just attitude reminder from Joshua. This whole event, Joshua draws the people back to the fact that this is the Lord. Like, he's the one that's leading us. I think that's just significant to note there in chapter 4. We go through a lot of the conquest of Canaan. You see their successes, their failures. People, you have the sin of Achan, what happens at Ai, lots of lessons there. Anything throughout the stories of the conquest that stood out to you that you want to talk about? We spend a lot of time on a lot of stories for sure.
Going back a little bit to Rahab, her faith and what happened to her stands out. I mean, we'll see in, chapters 10 and 11, where they're killing everybody, anything that breathes. But there was still an opportunity for those people to be saved, like Rahab. Rahab had faith in God, which stands in contrast to this time Joshua sends out a couple spies. Her faith stands in contrast to the spies that Moses sent out, where their hearts melted. They were afraid of everybody, said, we can't take it. Rahab says, yeah, we know the Lord is God. We're done for. And then also stands in contrast to the disobedience of Achan. We see even back then that, God accepts anyone with faith. It is not just about being descended from Abraham physically.
Absolutely. Do you want to answer the moral question for us in the story of Rahab? Got to prove of lying in certain situations. That one always stands out to me, that story. I mean, obviously she's saved for her faith. She's acknowledging this God, your God, that is with you, that we've seen with you, that brought you here. He's God. And she goes on to save the spies through means that would be contrary to the law of God. it's just, it's always an interesting story, and I've heard that question several times before. Does that mean, certain situations, it's okay? What's the answer? Richard, you got the answer, it looks like.
It's wrong. Okay, lying is wrong under any circumstance. You gotta have faith in God. As far as the answer to Rahab goes, I don't have the answer.
Okay.
I mean, Braden, lying is wrong. In World War II, I would have lied to hide the Jews. I would have, and I would have justified it by saying there's a greater good in lying to a corrupt and evil power. And again, I don't know. I kind of think that's what Rahab did. And maybe that's wrong. But like we've been talking about before, God calls us to make choices like that. And we would stand and have to answer for the decision that we make. So it's always a decision that you have to make, not lightly. It's not a light thing.
Sure.
To do something like that.
Also, are in keeping with what was just said about this, our standard is not what another human being did either yesterday or many centuries ago.
Sure.
Our standard is what God says. And Rahab certainly was delivered because of her faith. It's even mentioned in the New Testament for her faith.
Right.
Doesn't mean that everything that she did was necessarily in keeping with God's. I mean, she was a prostitute. There was a lot of things in her life that were not godly, but she's committed specifically for the faith that she demonstrated. I hadn't really thought of this until I think Matthew was speaking a minute ago, but and I think he was alluding to this. Maybe I'm just coming to realize it, but there's a really interesting comparison there or contrast between Rahab and Achan, because in Rahab's case, everything around her was corrupt, and yet she stood out and was saved for faith. In the case of Achan, people generally were following God's command, but his corruption caused a great penalty for all the people. And so we kind of have to think about, as we're making these decisions, that if my faith is in the Word of God and I'm choosing to obey, that can have a great influence on others. But even if it doesn't, God still understands I'm serving Him. By the same token, if I reject God's command, I may have a devastating influence on the lives of other people. Not that they were necessarily sinning, but there could be a consequence either on my children, my spouse, or my brethren in general, because my sin.
Yeah.
For some reason, Rahab, that moral dilemma comes up with Rahab, but you can look at anybody's life. What about David?
Yeah.
What about Moses? What about Noah? So they all have issues that stick out that God didn't cover up. It's all revealed to us. And yet they were people after God's heart. They were people with faith and obedience. And they didn't let one or however many sins, downfalls, whatever you want to call it, cause them to go completely astray. They were people of faith.
Obviously, that's the significant part in the story. Is you think about Rahab, you think about the Gibeonites in chapter 9. The path to their salvation, if you will, was not necessarily the actions they took. In both cases, we see they lied. Rahab lied, the Gibeonites lied. They lied about who they were from far off countries, Pharaohs. They lied to preserve themselves. Ultimately, they're saved. But the key distinction is the only ones that were saved because they professed that the God of Israel was God. I think, that ultimately, you could go to any story, you can point to the moral dilemmas. Was that right? Was that wrong? The message is the faith piece. What else about the conquest? Any stories? go to a lot of them.
You mentioned chapter 9, the Gibeonites. And it's interesting that I think this instance is the only time that I can recall that Joshua made it very obvious. And it's in verse 14 of chapter 9 of Joshua. And the men of Israel took some of the provisions, but they did not ask counsel of the Lord. So he made this peace treaty with the deceitful Gibeonites. And didn't ask the Lord, and it would come back to haunt them, as you'll read over and over again. They stayed in that area, and they were buried, that led to just all sorts of issues. But he's still my hero.
Yeah.
My favorite. Joshua's my favorite Old Testament character by far, except for this one instance that I can find.
You even look at Joshua's character after that, though. They make this mistake of not going to God for counsel. And so they spare the Gibeonites. And then when they find out who they are, it seems that they would have been justified at that point. Wipe them out. So that's not what we told you we would do. We're gonna be people of our word, and we're gonna do what we said. I think there's some even honorable things to mention in that story of Joshua.
Well, in the days of David, God holds them accountable because Saul had attacked the Gibeonites. Yeah, God holds them to that promise, even though the Gibeonites deceived them.
Sure. Richard, did you have something?
I was just gonna say, they made an oath and they kept it.
Yeah.
One other thing that stood out to me was, like Caleb's example, here. So Caleb, is from the tribe of Judah, and he says, I'm gonna go conquer these fortified cities where there are giants, and that will be my inheritance. So he sets an example, taking on the hardest task for himself. Then he goes and incentivizes others, says, I'll give my daughter to whoever conquers this other city. And Judah is really the tribe that seems to have the best success at driving out the Philistines. We'll see in Kings, they lasted longer than the northern kingdom. They seem to be more faithful to an extent. And there's a contrast here a little bit with Joshua. So with Joshua, in chapter 17, when his tribe, when Ephraim comes and says, we need more land, Joshua says, well, y'all can go take this land, y'all can drive the Philistines out of the forest country, and that'll be yours. And I don't know that Joshua necessarily did anything wrong here, but he didn't do the same as Caleb, where he went and set a great example, led the way, incentivized others to follow. And we see Ephraim is a lot less successful at driving out the Canaanites, and they don't last as long as Judah.
Wasn't that interesting? Like just the comment on character, you look at the character of Caleb, and Caleb's character was consistent. Caleb was the one who speaks up back in Numbers when they go to spy out the land. Like, we got this, we can do this. And it's Caleb again throughout the passages Matthew referenced. It's taking them on. His character is consistent. What do you think about as we get past the conquest, really into our reading from this past week? As I was reading through this, I couldn't help but think this is probably what it's like to teach, Leviticus and some of the genealogies and stuff like that. We get to the tribal allotments and all of those things. It's a lot of city names, a lot of places mentioned, and the mapping, and it's well, that's great. I'm glad we know that, I guess. What's the so what of knowing all of that?
I was gonna say, God kept his promise.
It also goes back to the idea that see show up a few more times in the Old Testament. this land is from the Lord.
Mm,
That their inheritance, not just that they have the land of Canaan, but down to individuals. The land that they have received is a gift from the Lord. And so like, for example, Naboth refuses to sell his vineyard to Ahab because it's his inheritance from the Lord.
mm. Yeah,
So these promises are not just kept with the nation, but we see them fulfilled in a very individual way.
sure.
Simple answer, without this, we wouldn't know where this land is.
Sure. Yeah,
It helps with that mapping and being able to get who's where and what they're doing, and what they have.
sure. Absolutely.
Going right along with that is, the idea that those who might say, well, all of these Bible stories are just mythical, they're not real. Well, there's no other myth that I know of, mythical legend, anything like that, that offers so much geographic detail. This is one of those places in the Bible we can turn and say, wow, you know, you can walk around the land.
Yeah.
And archaeologists have done that and found many of these sites that these ancient cities and towns, some still exist even today, but I mean, you know, they're still active even today, but if God wanted to give us evidence that his word is real, this is one of the ways he would do that, is give us locations, you know, give us things that we can go look and see with our own eyes.
Right in alignment with that, I typed out the text from a commentary I was reading here, just because I like the wording. Said the many specific names and towns of this part of the text provide a particularity to the gift that affirms it was the authentic fulfillment of God's promise to his people. It's so specific, there's no mistaking it. We have everything we need to go disprove it. We could just go say, hey, these places don't exist. This isn't real. Like we could destroy a whole lot of foundation there with all the detail that is given. As we wrap up today, there's several things near the end of Joshua that were on my mind. Joshua 22, it's a really interesting story where I think we can learn a lot about how to deal with brethren in conflict with one another. I'd be interested next was to maybe pick up with maybe a couple comments from Joshua 22. If you want to take a look at that and make some applications of the story of the Western tribes confronting the Eastern tribe over this altar. I think it's a really interesting story. That there's a lot of meaningful lessons to us on. When we get to Joshua 24, Joshua's asking the people to deepen or to reaffirm their covenant relationship with God. So I was thinking about something that we can all do this week. In addition to 22, just because we didn't get to talk about it this week. In chapter 24, Joshua reminds the people of their history. He asks them to make the choice. He makes his personal decision. He reminds them the consequence of their choice and tells them, get rid of the foreign gods. Interestingly enough, there at Shechem, if we go back to Genesis 35, this is where Jacob was when he's told, this is the land that I've promised to give you and your people. Get rid of foreign gods. And they bury the gods that Rachel took from her father, all the foreign gods and idols. If you just think about that and make some modern application there about our choice to follow the Lord, we can think about it very tangibly. How has God led us to where we're at in our life today? And it's always a good idea to reaffirm our commitment to follow him and to just put our why. Why have we chosen to do it? Joshua gives the people their reasons why. This is what God's done for you. Here's why you should. And we can do the same thing. We think about our story. How's God brought us here today? Why do I continue to choose to follow him? Think about that question this week. Thanks. Invite your friends next week.